And we're back on week 16 of the show. Just a couple of weeks to go until myself and the TYT company that I work for is moving out of our current studio. It's kind of a bittersweet thing. I'm not entirely sure what effect that's going to have on the show going forward. We're going to have to see when we get over there what sort of resources we have, how much time I have to sneak in here when no one else is here to film, and all of that sort of thing. I'll talk a bit more about that at the end of the program, so if you stick around till after all the news, we'll get into a bit of the inside baseball on the continuation of this program. But let's talk a bit about what's going to happen in Week 16's full episode. Not a lot of massive news stories. We're coming off of a Friday where there was obviously huge revelations about what's going on in Egypt. The violence just continues to escalate. We talked about that for the first third of the first hour yesterday. And so basically the theme today is, what the fuck is wrong with America? We're going to be going to a couple of different state representatives around the country and what they're up to. Spoiler alert, usually stupid bullshit. And also, we're going to be touching in a whole bunch of different aspects of the media. So what a couple of different news channels are going to do going forward, how they might influence the future of cable news, and then also a whole bunch of pundits saying crazy things. This is sort of like the Media Watch episode of my as yet unnamed program, I suppose. And so that's what we've got. We're going to be starting off with one, I guess, bit of good news. A federal judge has knocked down Oklahoma's anti-Sharia clause that it added to its constitution in 2010. Yeah, a couple of years ago they felt the need to add to their actual constitution, not just a law, the actual constitution, that Sharia law could not exist. And so I'm talking about Chief District Judge Vicki Miles LaGrange. She gave her explanation for why it needed to be struck down. Basically saying that you can't have something that particularly singles out one religion in opposition. We've got Ryan Kiesel of the ACLU of Oklahoma saying, this law unfairly singled out one faith and one faith only. This amendment was nothing more than a solution in search of a problem. We're thrilled that it has been struck down. That's mostly accurate. I do think that it was a solution to a particular problem. The problem just wasn't the creeping threat of Sharia in Oklahoma. The problem was that the Republicans and the conservatives who came up with this idea and try to push it in multiple states want to scare people. They want to ignite that xenophobia that's already raring to go in most conservatives in America. And they want to make you think, look, terrorism is a big problem, but not just terrorism. The Muslims are going to ruin the country in a whole bunch of different ways. They're taking over our legal system. Now, we know that that's bullshit. There's like 10 Muslims in America. Okay, that's an exaggeration. But even if there were 10 million, Sharia law is not going to take over the American legal system in the next 100 years. It's completely ignorant. It's completely insane. And even if it was going to happen, it's not going to happen in Oklahoma. If you try to think of a community that's known for being Muslim in America, maybe you think of what, like Dearborn, Michigan, that gets in the news every once in a while. There's nothing else really. So the idea that it could be taking over Oklahoma is obviously BS. This is just another shallow, see-through attempt to play up to, or play into, our natural predisposition towards xenophobia in this country. It's just another strike against Muslims, peaceful, peace-loving Muslims in America that have been demonized since 9/11. And so thankfully, the federal judge in this case, who has been trying to get this overturned for the past few years, was able to do so. Now, these sorts of anti-Sharia constitutional amendments do exist in other states, but I have a feeling that at some point, once the country has gotten back to its senses and stops thinking that there's a terrorist around every corner, maybe they can be stripped out of those states' constitutions as well. And what's really amazing about the entire attempt to get rid of Sharia law is when you actually look at what hardcore Muslims who actually believe that the state should be governed by Sharia, what they actually would want in practice, and what those who think that their literal view of the Bible should be enshrined in law in America, what they actually want is really not that dissimilar. Maybe in the Christian version there will be a little bit less chopping off of hands, I suppose, if we're comparing fundamentalists on both sides. But really, demonization of gays, demonization of subjugation of women, demonization of outsiders, a belief that only those who follow that religion should have all the rights that we would normally expect in a society they should have. Like, they love to fight each other, but there's really not that many differences. Worries about sex among the youth and everything, and at the same time trying to marry off the youths to people who are much older. we live in a crazy country where our brand of crazy, Christianity, is so normal, it's so fine. Obviously, we're a Christian nation, but Sharia law is the big threat that we need to deal with. So hopefully as a country we can move on from that eventually. Anyway, another brand of crazy we're going to talk about. A Tea Party state legislator in Tennessee was talking to a group about immigration, and it got really ugly. I'm talking here about Scott Desjardins. And what basically happened was a young girl stood up, and she had a question for him, and it rapidly got into really uncomfortable, really xenophobic, and anti-Hispanic territory. Let's watch.
I have a dad, and he's undocumented, and what can I do so he can stay with me?
What's your name?
Joanna.
What can you do?
Joanna, thank you for being here, and thank you for coming forward and speaking. This is a big, intimidating crowd, and I appreciate you coming forward and asking your question. But the answer still kind of remains the same: that we have laws, and we need to follow those laws, and that's where we're at.
Now, my big opposition to what you saw in that video, the fact that she says, I'm really worried about losing my father, and he says, well, rules are rules, it's not even really with what he said. Now, I think that what he said certainly could have contained a whole lot more compassion, and even beyond the actual statement, he could support policies that would do the humane thing and reunite families. That would be nice. But my problem isn't really with what he did, it's with what the crowd did. In the same way that the Republican debates during the previous Republican primary of just a couple of years ago was so ugly and so cringeworthy, this crowd caused the same reaction in me. The fact that they don't just want the law to be followed, they delight in the fact that this Hispanic family is going to be punished. The fact that this girl that's right there, this isn't anonymous over the internet sort of BS, they're sitting next to her, that they just love that she's going to lose her father, and fuck him for trying to be a part of this country. Screw him, go back to whatever country you came from, and hopefully we can send your girl packing in a couple of years too. Thankfully she has papers, so that's not going to happen. But it is just disgusting, the display that they put on, and that they regularly put on in these sorts of town halls. For some reason, when you call something a town hall, the crowd feels like it's okay to act like you're at a goddamn Klan rally. Like you can, any sort of anti-Hispanic, anti-homophobic behavior you want. I believe in San Antonio, a former veteran, a gay veteran, was speaking and was roundly booed by the crowd, a crowd of conservative assholes. I guess it's the crowd mentality. I guess I shouldn't be surprised at this point. But another point that I want to make is, I've been reading these articles recently about why the Tea Party succeeded, why it still exists after a few years, since it started in like early 2009. And they always say the reason it succeeds is it's managed to avoid the crazy elements and it's focused on economic issues. It's not about the social values and stuff like that. What the fuck economic values are they discussing here? Why are they cheering based on economic grounds? They're not. They're driven by crazy xenophobia and hatred for minorities, particularly Hispanics. You can't talk about immigration in this country right now without generating a response like that from the right, because they genuinely hate these people. They don't see them to be humans in the same way that they see white Americans or white immigrants to be. Like if she'd been talking about her Canadian father being deported, do you really believe that the crowd would have booed her, would have cheered with the fact that he's going to be sent back to his country of origin? I don't think so. And what I love here is Scott Desjardins, who I've given somewhat of a pass on that particular issue, says that we have laws and we need to follow those laws, and that's where we're at. This article that I'm reading has a little bit of details on his past intersections, I guess, with the legal system. Now, he's a former physician and anti-choice crusader. You might have heard of this guy, by the way. We've talked about him on the Young Turks a year or two ago. He engaged in multiple extramarital affairs with female patients. Now, that's not necessarily against the law, although the fact that it's his patients gets into some ethical grounds, and the fact that he was having an affair, obviously ethical grounds, but as libs, we'd give him pretty much a pass because what people want to do in their marriages is between them and their spouse, I suppose. But also, he is staunchly pro-life. By the way, here's what he said. Here's what he did. When he got one of these women that he had an affair with pregnant, he pressured her to have an abortion Because it's all well and good to say that, you know, these other people that want to have abortions should do the ethical thing and bring the baby to term. But when it's actually him, and it might ruin his medical practice, might ruin his marriage that he's trying to maintain, then it's a big problem, and you just got to kill that baby. So I love the hypocrisy there. And finally, another patient charged him with prescribing narcotic painkillers to the woman and routinely smoking marijuana with him. So if there's one thing Scott Desjardins likes, it's the rule of law. And so this story just has a mixture of everything. Hypocrisy about how pro-life he is, hypocrisy about drugs, and obviously a heavy dose of anti-Hispanic rhetoric. And so I hope that as a country we move past this. And I have to imagine that these people are dying off at a rapid pace because they tend to be incredibly old. But man, it's horrendous to see what these crowds get up to sometimes. Okay, now let's move into our media watch section of the show, I suppose. Al Jazeera America is set to launch early next week, and with the creation and the beginning of that program and that network, they're hoping to mark a significant change in the way cable news operates in America. And so far, some of the things they're saying sound pretty good. Now, I'm going to gloss over some of this. Obviously, there are some issues with the fact that they're being bankrolled by a country that does not exactly have the best record when it comes to certain areas of human rights and things like that. That's for another video, and I'm sure we'll talk about it. And before you get into the comments and start saying, oh, you're going to badmouth Al Jazeera because they canceled the current show, or the current network, I suppose, we really have absolutely zero hard feelings about Al Jazeera. I really don't care. I'm focused on the online end of things anyway. And so, in some ways, I'm actually rooting for Al Jazeera. I have a few people that I used to work with that are going to be working with them. But anyway, the president of Al Jazeera America, Kate O'Brien, has a particular message that she wants to put across. And she says that one thing that Al Jazeera is not going to do on its network is focus on these frigging insane trials that MSNBC, Fox, and especially HLN cover non-stop. They have some programs that's all they do, is every day they find some random trial to cover. And so she's saying that Al Jazeera America is not going to do this. And the obvious response to that, the obvious criticism is, well, maybe that's just what the American public wants to see. And I think there might actually be something to that. Kate O'Brien says that she disagrees with the premise that that's what American audiences want. And instead she says that that's what Americans have at their disposal to watch. Basically, it comes down to a resource issue, and it's a lot easier for a cable channel to put up a trial that has essentially pool video rolling all day long. You don't have to be spending money and resources doing other things. And she says specifically that she's happy that Al Jazeera America will have the monetary resources necessary to cover stories around the globe. Now, I am sure that that is part of what's leading these other networks to focus so much on trial coverage. You set up a camera in the courtroom, and then you just get to analyze the facial expressions that the person that's being tried makes. And that is a lot cheaper, I would have to imagine, than sending reporters around the globe. Now, some of that still does go on. CNN, to their credit, does send Erin Burnett in her vest to Egypt from time to time and things like that. But for the most part, that's an area that the mainstream cable news networks do not do. TYT, we'd love to send people around the globe, but we don't have nearly enough money. So she's saying that she won't have that. Now also, Ali Velshi is a former CNN anchor who's going to be moving over for the launch of Al Jazeera America. Ali says, people who are disaffected by what they're accustomed to seeing on cable news will detect the difference immediately. And he said that the channel won't focus on the things that they don't think are news and won't necessarily book guests who take the most extreme views. You will know that it's not the same as Fox and MSNBC and CNN from day one. I love that Ali does not even mention HLN there. Now, look, we have a lot of criticism for these major networks playing up stories that are complete BS. And the reason that we do that, and it might seem hypocritical at times, is they are supposed to be news-focused, news-oriented. That's what they do. And so when they choose to take just one trial because the woman who killed her husband is pretty, or because it involves a young child, or they take one kidnapping out of the hundreds or thousands of kidnappings that are ongoing at any particular time and focus on it because the kid happens to be a young blonde white person. I have a problem with that because it's not just that it's not news, it's that I believe that by watching that, it is teaching people that that is news, that that is fine to focus on. And so when you pretend that a stupid subject is newsworthy or that stupid material is smart material, then you are training people to focus on the wrong thing. And I know what you're saying, John. You host tytu university, you do stupid stories all the time. That's true. We're not CNN. We're not primarily a news gathering or a news reporting organization. We are a demographically focused, topical organization. But CNN and Fox, and to a lesser extent HLN, should know better. Now, will Al Jazeera actually do this in the long run? They certainly have a lot of money coming to them from the Qatari government. I hope that they try. I think that over time, as they start to find out what the American public actually likes, and their desire for international news is not as high as we wish that it would, there might be some pressure to focus on these stupid trials. But I, for one, hope that they can avoid that temptation, because I think that it's actually doing a lot of harm to America. Okay, now let's move on to another organization, a news organization, that certainly does a lot of harm to America on a daily basis. We're going to get to the general idea about what Fox is going to do in the future, but we're going to focus on one person in particular first. Laura Ingram was filling in for Bill O'Reilly late last week, and she was talking about Duck Dynasty. I hope that you're lucky enough to not be familiar with that program. I had to do some research on it because of this story, but I wanted to cover what she says about it, because she has an interesting argument for why she thinks Duck Dynasty is this great program that more people need to watch. Let's watch.
What's the allure of watching a bunch of long-haired rednecks sitting around teasing each other, talking about their business, relationships, and family lives? The shows focus on family, country, and faith. Each episode, in fact, ends with a prayer. How often today do we see families in prayer on entertainment television? As families have disintegrated in America, as our culture has become hypersexualized, as kids are losing their innocence at younger and younger ages, I think it's undoubtedly a welcome relief to many TV viewers to just watch a program that doesn't offend their core values. Duck Dynasty depicts a colorful, intact, dare I say, traditional family, and they're leading a happy and really successful life. What a concept!
So Laura Ingram, obviously a big fan of Duck Dynasty there. I don't know if she's ever actually watched the program. She seems at least a little bit familiar with it. It's entirely possible that just her producers took a little bit of footage of them praying, put it in front of her, and she thought, well, that's good, I like prayer. But we're going to talk about this, because there are a couple different elements here that I disagree with. Now, on the one hand, I do think that Duck Dynasty, at least in some ways, is a less offensive program than many of these other poor glorification reality shows that we've seen coming out recently. I've been reading up on this, and I'm beginning to think that shows like Here Comes Honey Boo Boo and other programs like that, Swamp People, that focus on the misery of the poor or that sort of thing, I do think that that is causing some harm to the culture. I do think that it causes people to look at the poor in a particular way, and perhaps desensitizes them to how bad it actually is for them. I mean, the fact that you take a family like Honey Boo Boos and you send them go-karting or something like that, that does not mean that the day-to-day life of poor Americans is any sort of carnival, okay? But I think that by watching these reality shows and having them be called reality shows, it teaches Americans that that's what it's actually like to be poor in America. And so I think that they do some damage in that respect. Now, look, on Duck Dynasty, they are a wealthy family. They've done well. They're entrepreneurial and all of that. And so I suppose it sidesteps that a bit. So instead, we're going to focus on the traditional and the prayer and blah, 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 all that stuff you heard Laura Ingram saying. So whether or not she actually watches it, I understand that there's not a lot of overtly religious programming, I suppose. And so if you're religious, you are probably going to like this sort of thing. And yet for me, it triggers some warning signs. Laura Ingram is saying that simply because they pray and they're not all screwing each other on screen, this is something that we should laud. But I don't know if that's necessarily the case. I mean, have you followed some of these reality show families and what's happened to them long term after their rise to stardom? If anything, I want to cover this just so that you can look back in a few years after this family starts suing each other and one of them murders the other. Then we'll look back and think maybe praying wasn't enough. And that's really the problem that I have. I don't think that in general terms there's anything wrong with a family praying. If it makes you feel better, if it brings you together, feel free to do that. But she seems to think that simply because this family prays, they are traditional and they are moral and we should see more of them. They can be doing all sorts of horrible things day to day to each other. Praying doesn't change that. In many instances, praying is just a way to feel better without actually having to do anything. And so I think that it's particularly naive of Laura Ingram in this case to laud this family simply because they pray at the end of every program. And by the way, the fact that they pray at the end of every episode seems to imply to me that it's much less about communing with some higher being and more to do with branding the show in a particular way and trying to shamelessly appeal to religious Americans. I'm not saying it's bad business for them. It just, to me, seems a little bit see-through. And also, I love as families have disintegrated in America, as our culture has become hypersexualized, as kids are losing their innocence at younger and younger ages, blah, blah, blah. There's never been a generation that did not say every one of those things about the generations that follow them. In this case, it might be a little bit more accurate because of high-speed streaming porn, I suppose. But the real problem here, and the final point that I want to make on this is, she seems to believe that not praying on TV is what's causing American culture to disintegrate and the families to disintegrate, or that if we did pray, we could stall off some of that disintegration. And that's not the case. There are a lot of things that are causing families to fall apart in America. It's not the lack of prayer, whether in the home or on TV. How about the fact that over the past 30 years, despite the fact that productivity is up and we're working more hours than we ever were as a nation, we make less money than we used to? How about the fact that preceding and especially after the economic collapse of a few years ago, almost entirely, like 90% out of 100% of the gains have gone towards the top 1%. There are a lot of things that are putting incredible strain, both economically and psychologically, on American families, and I don't think that it's a lack of prayer fundamentally. And so it's very convenient for Laura Ingram in this case to focus on the prayer element, because the sorts of solutions to these problems that we actually need, like stimulating the economy, like extending unemployment benefits, working to improve the economy, those are things that at the end of the day, she wouldn't actually support anyway. And so yeah, very convenient there. So that's one Fox host. We're going to move to Fox in general now. Fox News is in trouble. It's got quite a few problems. Now look, when I say that it's in trouble, I don't mean that it's not at the top of the heap right now for cable news. It is. It regularly gets more viewers than any other cable news network. And why not when there's only one program that directly appeals to conservatives in America and the rest of the more reasonable, more rational news networks have to split their views among liberals across America? That makes some sense. But they are losing some ratings. So if you look at the second quarter of this year of 2013, Fox lost 11% of its younger viewer audience compared to the same time in 2012. And if you look back over the last few years, they've lost a far more significant portion of their young viewers. And we should not be surprised about this, because it's likely that their current viewers are not changing the station. They're not tuning into other news networks. They're dying because they seem to be 70 to 90 years old on average. I mean, we've seen the median age of Fox viewers is 65, and the reason that it's not higher is that they don't actually count any higher than that. If they were to, God knows what that number would actually be. And so if you're Roger Ailes and you're attempting to have a network that doesn't die in 10 years like its viewers are, then you need to make some changes. And so he's trying to do that. We see Megyn Kelly is going to be moving into the 9 p.m. slot, displacing Sean Hannity there. That seems like probably an appeal to possibly a younger audience, since she is younger in appearance, and Sean Hannity is never, ever, ever going to appeal to young Americans. Why would he? But even if that doesn't succeed, it should appeal to their predominantly male audience, and I'm sure the old males will love seeing Megyn Kelly in prime time. They're making other changes. I mean, this Megyn Kelly thing might cause a domino effect of other programming changes as well. And for all we know, Sean Hannity might eventually lose his show altogether. We do see him being dropped by the Cumulus Radio Network, and I simply can't imagine that he's doing well, since his program over the past 6 months or so seems to be entirely based around demonizing Hispanics and African Americans. And this is during a time in which the GOP and conservatives in general are trying to appeal to racial minorities to make up for the fact that the white base is a smaller and smaller percentage of the voting public in every presidential election. And so they're doing what they can to try to appeal to a younger audience. They say they're going to be funding more digital content and things like that. I will believe it when I see it. And look, Megyn Kelly, for whatever reason, appears to be more reasonable than other Fox hosts, but give it time. She's said some crazy things in the past, and there's no reason to believe that she won't in the future. But I do have a suggestion for what I think they can do to actually succeed over the next 10 to 30 years. If they want to succeed, they need to focus on what they say they focus on now. If you were to ask them what they say now, or what their mission statement is, it's to focus on small government. And they say that, and in some areas they mean it, but certainly not in other areas. I mean, you can't say that we need to spend less money on food stamps and yay, small government, but then also talk about how awesome transvaginal ultrasounds are later in the same program. I think that young Americans do see through that. And while they will always try to appeal to conservatives, they need to understand that conservatives who are 70 years old are not the same as conservatives who are 20 years old. And so this overly Christian, overly anti-gay, overly minority message that they've been putting across, trying to appeal to those old conservatives, is simply not going to work with this new generation up and coming that's becoming politically acclimated right now. And so I think if they want to succeed and still stay true to basically what their message is, they need to change over to a more libertarian message. And I don't know that they can do that. I think that their economic message could, for the most part, stay the same, but they need to back off of some of the divisive social issues that they've been pushing. They've got to stop demonizing homosexuals. They have to stop demonizing minorities, because I just don't believe that young conservatives hate these groups to the same extent that the older conservatives do. I think that they're going to have to change their stance on marijuana. That's one of the big ones, because these young libertarians are just, they're not buying the war on drugs any longer. And then finally, young conservatives, perhaps, but not young libertarians, they don't support these wars of aggression that Fox has been pushing over the past 10 years. And so these are some very hard areas to make progress on as a network, and it might involve other staff changes. Like getting rid of Sean Hannity might not be enough. Eventually, old Papa Bear Bill O'Reilly might have to be put to pasture as well, because that dude is, you know, say what you want about him, he is to some extent a maverick. And if they actually say, you got to change your message on the wars, on gays, on marijuana, I don't think that Bill has it in him to do it. And so these are my suggestions for Fox News. These are my suggestions for Roger Ailes, how you could actually appeal to a younger demographic, and that would be to embrace young libertarians across the country. Do they have it in them to do it? Probably not. Okay, now we're going to turn to some other crazy Republicans from around the country. We got a little catfight between Glenn Beck and Oprah Winfrey. Now, this is not about the handbags, thankfully, because I'm sick of talking about that. No, this is going back to Trayvon Martin. Glenn Beck is not having it. Oprah Winfrey recently in some way implied that there was a connection or an analogy to be made between Trayvon Martin and Emmett Till, and Glenn Beck is not happy with it. Let's watch.
Oprah Winfrey, you disgust me. As a woman who has gone through hell and back and made it and pulled yourself out by the bootstraps, you made it. You made it. You grew up with hate from your own race. You grew up with rape in your own race, and you pulled yourself out, and the American people, both black and white, yellow and red, it doesn't matter the color, they saw you make it. They saw you overcome everything that you had faced, and we celebrated that. So much so you're the most famous and most accomplished black woman in the history of America. You have your own network because we celebrated that you made it. You disgust me. Why are you telling everybody else they can't make it? Why are you telling us that white people are the problem?
To his credit, Glenn Beck is doing the best that he can to hide his racism in that clip, but it still comes through. And so we're going to focus on a couple of things that he said there. I love that he says, you grew up with hate from your own race. You grew up with rape in your own race. And certainly that is not untrue, I suppose. But I love that all of the hate towards Oprah Winfrey during her slow rise to the top only came from African Americans. There was no white opposition whatsoever. And so the idea that he can hide the fact that white Americans took a long time to accept Oprah Winfrey, or that there's a significant portion of white America who still does not support her, I think that's comical. And so I love the basic message here, if we can really drill down to what he's saying, is we allowed you to succeed. We did not stop you from becoming rich and famous. And so how dare you betray us by actually doing something in your mind to increase the status of black Americans, to get through some of the racial strife that we have right now. How dare you? We allowed you to get rich, and now you owe us, and so how dare you say anything about the problems of African Americans? And that's obviously ridiculous. I don't have a long list of quotes from Glenn Beck on Oprah Winfrey in the past. Perhaps you can look them up and post them in the comments. I have a feeling he has not been her biggest fan over the past few decades. But the idea that the only problem for her during her rise to the top was black American views of her, that's fucking ridiculous. And the idea that simply because an African American can succeed in America, because you can point to one example of success, the idea that clearly now there is no racism is also ridiculous. He says, why are you telling everyone else they can't make it? Why are you telling us that white people are the problem? First of all, in saying that Trayvon Martin died because he is African American, first of all, seems relatively true to me. I have to imagine that if he was a white teenager, George Zimmerman would not have felt as threatened by him, would not have followed him, and would not have gotten in the conflict with him. That does not say that you can't succeed in America. It's just saying that if you are African American, you are going up against a different set of obstacles than other Americans. And you don't need to listen to Oprah Winfrey to say that. You don't need to look at the case of Trayvon Martin to see that. That's obviously true. Yes, Barack Obama is half black and he managed to become the president. Yes, Oprah Winfrey is African American and became rich. But that does not mean that for the vast, vast majority of black Americans, there are not major obstacles to success, starting from a very young age all the way up into your career eventually. And so I don't entirely know what's causing this little catfight. I don't know why Glenn Beck felt the need to attack her there. But even those Americans on the right who are not themselves strongly racist, who don't, drop the N-word like Paula Deen and do not personally advocate for policies that would harm black Americans, and personally I think that Glenn Beck is a part of that group, but even if he wasn't, there seems to be this very strong impulse to deny that it exists, because I think even if you are not a racist, you live in fear of being called one, and as a conservative, I'm sure Glenn Beck feels that fear quite often. Because even if they're not racist, their views of blacks are probably hardly understanding, I suppose. And so I have to assume that that's what's causing his little rift with Oprah Winfrey there. I expect that she is unlikely to respond to it, although she does have that movie coming out, and so perhaps she wants the publicity. But anyway, whether you agree with her comparison between Trayvon Martin and Emmett Till, it is ridiculous to assume that she suffered no racism from white Americans in her rise to the top, or that her rise does not implies that African Americans now have it easy. I think that even Glenn Beck realizes that that's ridiculous. Okay. It seems as if the bar that you have to pass to become a state representative these days in America is basically buried underground, because every week we see more and more of these state reps profiled saying crazy racist things, tweeting insane things and having to backtrack. And yes, I understand there are thousands of state reps, and so I suppose it's easy to find one or two every week. It just keeps on coming. And so today we've got the head of the Oregon Republican Party. They have a new chairman. His name is Art Robinson, and so he's another one of these state level political operatives. And he's got these crazy things that he has said, and so I can't wait to tell you them. The main one, the first one, is on nuclear waste, and that's what the big headline is. He thinks basically that sprinkling nuclear waste into the water or possibly over the land of America would be good for American health long term. This is what he said. All we need to do with nuclear waste is dilute it to a low radiation level and sprinkle it over the ocean, or even over America after hormesis is better understood and verified with respect to more diseases. If we could use it to enhance our own drinking water here in Oregon, where background radiation is low, it would hermetically enhance our resistance to degenerative diseases. Alas, this would be against the law. Now, I'm not saying that it's not impossible that in some way, some version of this thesis could actually be good for our health. That's not impossible. I mean, vaccines sort of operate in a similar way, I guess, although we don't just sprinkle them over the ocean. But the fact that he said it so confidently, we should do this. We should take nuclear waste and sprinkle it all over America. Alas, this would be against the law. I don't know who is in charge of vetting the head of the Oregon Republican Party, but they fell asleep at the wheel this time. And just to give you an idea, this is not the only crazy thing he said. We've got some other quotes for you. On public schools, he says, public education, tax-financed socialism, has become the most widespread and devastating form of child abuse and racism in the United States. And he goes on to say that basically because of public education, we're too stupid to operate in a modern economy. That might be true, but I don't think the private education would be much of an improvement. And the idea that it is itself a racist system, look, there are huge problems with the public education system in America, but reverting to an entire system of private schools where the poor would be basically screwed and might not be able to send their kids to school at all hardly seems like an improvement, although that might be a hard sell for Art Robinson. Furthermore, he says on climate change, and remember, this is a guy who believes himself to be some kind of scientist because he's talking about hormesis and stuff like that. There is substantial scientific evidence that increases in atmospheric carbon dioxide produce many beneficial effects upon the natural plant and animal environments of the earth. And I love hearing conservatives say stuff like this because it is an indication to me that they are starting to realize that they have lost the fight against global warming, or against the scientific and the public acceptance of the fact of global warming. Because now you have this guy saying it would be great for plants. You have other people coming out this week, Republicans, saying that carbon dioxide is good for plants. You have the guy saying that global warming is causing polar bears to thrive. And so these messages tell me that they realize that they are losing this argument. And so now, if people are going to accept that climate change is happening, we need to convince them that it's a good thing for the earth. And I suppose that that's progress. So eventually, a lot of these statements are from previous years. He's more recently said that he has moved on, that some of the things he talked about are politically impossible, or that they're too complicated to explain in a short time. That certainly seems to be the case. And perhaps it seems like I'm unfairly picking on this guy, but look, he's the head of the GOP in that state. This is the sort of person who finds candidates to run for state office, congressmen, senators, and things like that. He will be involved in those decisions. He will be involved in policy making in Oregon. And we need to shine a light on these dark corners of America, because if we don't, then maybe someday they run for governor, or they run for senator, or they run for president, and these videos need to be out there to cut them off at the knees before that happens. Final story. This is a ridiculous one, so relax. Newt Gingrich wants to be hip, and so he recently joined Instagram, sent out his first picture. Let's take a look. So, the first reaction to this is obviously, wow, that is a goofy picture. Now look, obviously the picture is goofy. I don't know why it looks that photoshopped, but it does. I don't believe that it actually is photoshopped. I think that he actually is in that environment. The hat's a little bit goofy, but the reason that I wanted to focus on this is not just to down on Newt Gingrich, who is a pretty horrible guy, who occasionally says good things. Like recently, he was talking about how we need to back off some of these neocon foreign policy ideas. He said some good things about climate change in the past, and then backtracked. Some good things about same-sex marriage, and then we'll probably backtrack. The reason I wanted to talk about this is that it is important for you. I have to assume that many of the people watching this are liberals. It is important for you to always check yourself for bias in how you react to things. And so, if you reacted to this picture the same way that I did, wow, look at this clown, he looks stupid, that's bias. That just is. Because imagine if this was Joe Biden. Imagine if this was Hillary Clinton. Imagine if this was Al Franken. We would probably be okay with it. And I'm being perfectly honest. If that was Joe Biden, I would think it was pretty awesome. And now, yes, he would look cooler in the hat. He would look cooler draped in primates or whatever. But we do have to, every once in a while, realize that our reactions are not always perfectly rational. Just because we come from the ideology that tends to have much more respect for the scientific method, for logic, for reason, and things like that, does not mean that we do not react emotionally at times. And so I have to admit that my reaction to this picture was emotional. I chuckled just a little bit. And anyway, Newt Gingrich is, at the very least, he's backing up what he said during the debates during the Republican primary, that he was an amateur zoologist. Apparently the dude actually does love animals. And that's kind of a point in his favor, I suppose. Anyway, that's all the news for today. As I alluded to in the intro, not a huge news day. None of these stories are exactly world-breaking or news-shaking or anything like that. It's just sort of a glance across America and give you an idea of what some of these politicians and pundits are up to, what the possible future of Fox News and Al Jazeera America might be. These are important things that we need to focus on from time to time, and I'm sure that next week we will resume hard news coverage of foreign policy and the debate over immigration and things like that. But anyway, as I alluded to in the beginning, I do not know, I assume at least one, possibly two more shows of my Untitled show will be filmed in the current studio. I don't know exactly what will happen after that. I assume that I will be able to maintain the same sort of schedule of shooting on the weekend by myself. but I can't guarantee it. And if that does not happen, I will upload some sort of video, some sort of vlog or something explaining it. But it's been 16 weeks, and so just taking a little bit look back over what's happened. When I started it, I felt pretty sure that I would continue. I knew that I needed the practice at that point. I felt that it would be a good thing in case I ended up hosting the main show by myself, which actually happened about 2 weeks after starting this program. And it's been 16 weeks without missing one, and so I'm going to give myself a little bit of a round of applause. I hope that you've enjoyed it. As I always say at the end of the program, the only reason I do this is because I like having this dialogue between myself and you guys, that I put out the videos, that we talk about it, we tweet about it, we talk about it in the comments. It's fun. And so all the other programs that I host, you know, Common Room, TYTU, the main show, and things like that, it's always with other people. So there's always a layer, I suppose, between me and you, because I'm not talking directly to you, I'm talking to my co-host. And so it's nice to do a show where I don't have that between me and the audience. And as always, if you have stories you'd like to see covered in the future, I love getting tweets of story suggestions from you guys. Obviously, I don't always cover them, partially because sometimes if they come like 5 days before I film, then the stories will be way out of date. More likely, it's because it's stories that we cover on the main show, and I try not to have overlap in what we cover. But I do always love getting them anyway. And so I've enjoyed filming this today. I hope you guys have a good week, and I'll see you on the next episode.